and welcome to this afternoon's webinar session. It's namaskar to all my friends and a warm welcome to everybody. I hope we've got some global audience here today too. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Ramesh Bhai Patni, one of our favorite speakers in the Friends group. And today I think we have a very relevant talk on human emotions. We've all been involved in these days of isolation due to the current situation, and it has led to, I'm sure, certain emotions, certain turmoils, and hopefully a level of joy too. So we basically engage ourselves in desires, in actions, in consequences. And I think all these things lead us to certain emotions and hopefully emotional well-being too. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ramesh Bhai Patni to take us through a Hindu perspective on emotions. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak Bhai, and welcome to everyone for joining this talk. So I'm going to just share my screen. Great. So today I'm going to talk about emotions. And this is a particularly Hindu perspective. And there are various things I'm going to talk about. And like Deepak mentioned, that emotional kind of energies were running very high during the early days of COVID. And in some of my work, which I do in counseling and psychotherapy, we had almost a 200% rise in people looking for help, especially with very kind of distressing symptoms of the early days of COVID. So it is a very relevant kind of topic at the moment. And I just want to kind of take you through understanding some of the ideas about emotions in the Hindu philosophical and systems of thinking. So first of all, I'm going to talk about understanding emotions, very briefly to say what emotions are. Then the rasa theory of emotions. And you can see on the right-hand side that, there's various emotions, which I'll call the Navarasa, the 9 rasas, which are the emotions, which are then talked about from a particular point of view, from an art and literature point of view. Then I'm going to talk about the types of emotion, the formation of emotions in relationship to this rasa theory of emotion, and then a Vedantic view of emotion, because this takes another kind of turn as we go from literature and arts and expression of emotion in that dimension to looking at the spiritual aspect. So the context changes here, and we see how emotions are dealt with within a spiritual context. And in particular, I'll be talking about the Bhagavad Gita and the emotion, because here again, there is a kind of specific way in Bhagavan Shri Krishna deals with emotion and how to regulate the emotion to take you to the spiritual goal. So let's look at the understanding of emotions first. So emotions are experienced frequently on a daily basis. So during the day, we have almost 60,000 thoughts which are coming through our mind. And this is an established kind of research fact that 60,000 cognitions or thoughts are coming through the mind on a daily basis. And with each one of these thoughts which come about, there is an associated emotion which is likely to be there. Whether it is in the program, whether it is intensely experienced or not experienced, there is a thought and a feeling which are kind of associated to it. Emotions also give us a lot of information about ourselves and others, allowing us to kind of self-regulate in the sense that we are regulating ourselves, so that if I see, for example, somebody being angry or upset, then I know that I have to respond in a certain manner. And if myself I'm angry or experiencing some emotion, then I can also self-regulate, because it gives me certain signs and symptoms in my body and my mind. They are also the basis of determining the state of well-being of a person, just like we are talking just now, is that certain emotions are associated with well-being, and others are associated with a sense of mental distress. And these are very important in the psychological way, because then we know that we are not feeling well. This is an emotion which is related to distress in the mind. And therefore, we can say that certain states of well-being are associated with certain emotions and vice versa. They're involved in all kinds and aspects of human behavior, from extreme violence to high altruism. So there is a whole spectrum of emotions which is available in the human experience. And we can see that, we come across this emotion on a daily basis. And moment to moment, even sometimes we experience these things in our day-to-day life. And of course, we know they are used and sometimes abused in our daily life by almost everyone. And by that, I mean, for example, there is a kind of psychological abuse which can go on. And again, we get many cases whereby, there's some kind of abuse which is going on and it is expressed through emotion. So, for example, anger becomes a very controlling emotion. If you want to manipulate or control somebody, you express that emotion. And by that means, emotional means, one can actually abuse the emotion to make other people do what you want to do. And also they seem to energize us and appear to be at the center of our identity, who we are, and how we actually function in the world, what our main emotions are that we express in our lives, and how other people see us as well. So sometimes people say, oh, this person is so quiet and calm, and here's another person who's very jumpy and energized all the time, very excited all the time. So even our personality is somehow recognized through our emotions. And there is, of course, a relationship between culture and emotion that has been looked at for many decades in terms of the research and what is that connection between culture and emotion. So just kind of briefly to mention this relationship, that there are three paradigms which are being followed in research. Number one, that there are universal emotions across the cultures. So we can identify, yes, anger, is it the same in the Japanese culture? Is it the same in the Chinese or American or British culture? And is it expressed in the same way? Is it connected with the cultural context of these emotions and so on? The other paradigm which is being followed is that there are only certain components of those emotions that are the same across the cultures. Not all emotions are universal. And of course, there are cultural differences in emotions as well. So these are the kind of things which we can think about when we talk about culture and emotion. And although I'm not going to kind of dwell too much on it, but culture and religion are, of course, we know are connected in many different ways, in many different dimensions. And therefore, it will lead us to think about, the spiritual connection between, culture and emotion, and to see how that plays a part in our daily life. So we know that emotions play an important role in personal relationships. There are cultural differences in how we manage and understand our relationship, and influence is also kind of associated. The cultural influence, there are differences in how we regulate our emotions as well. So regulation of emotion is, there are differences in culture, how we regulate our emotions, and not only that, but how we actually express our emotions. And whether we do express our emotions or not, that is also something which is related to one's culture. For example, we can say very generally that Western tendency towards arousal of emotion and success, whereas the Eastern tendency towards equanimity and discipline. So sometimes we can see there are differences in the approach, sometimes the expression is different, sometimes the emotion itself is different, sometimes certain components of the emotions are different. So this is just to make a note that there are differences in terms of culture and emotion. Okay, so let's dive straight into the rasa theory of emotion. And this is particularly a very much a Hindu perspective. And reference to rasa is made in the Vedic hymns as well, that refers to it as a stream of consciousness, as illumination and offering oneself to the universe itself. Very kind of general way in which rasa is kind of mentioned in the Vedic hymns. And as we know that there are the four Vedas, and the Vedic hymns are actually the hymns which are in the Vedas, and they talk about various different things about nature, about divine, about the human individual, etc. And it is kind of associated with the stream of consciousness. In other words, what is going on in consciousness itself, and illuminating, in a sense, and offering oneself to the universe itself. And it was in the 4th century AD that Bharat Muni, in his Natya Shastra, so Natya means drama, Shastra means the science of drama, he enunciated this theory of art. And this theory actually focused on the idea of rasa as a kind of conceptual framework for the first time. And the word rasa can mean juice, it can mean sap, it can mean essence, condiment, or even a flavor. This is the kind of general meaning of rasa. In this particular context, rasa, of course, we are talking about in the different kind of emotions and sentiments and mood which are invoked by a work of art. For example, a piece of music. Now we know that music tends to have an immediate emotional impact on ourselves. So that when we listen to certain kinds of music in a minor key, we know that there is something which is of a kind of serious nature, or even a sad. It evokes a certain emotion within ourselves. Similarly, when we look at a work of art, it creates sometimes a sense of reverence and awe, which is arising in us as an emotion in relationship to that work of art or the piece of music. So it is mainly translated, rasa is mainly translated as emotion, sentiment, or mood. And it is a realization of the impersonal contemplative aspect of the self. Now, this rasa, as I will explain, can be looked at in many different levels, and we can see that it expresses or it requires certain things to come together in order for the total experience of what we are seeing within ourselves at all levels of our being. So, in the intellect, as thoughts, feelings in the mind, and various sensations which arise in the body. And according to Bharat Muni, he says no composition can proceed without rasa. Now, we know that on the stage there will be some dramatic kind of events taking place. And the whole idea of this theory of rasa is that it is a method by which the same emotion can be evoked within the audience. And this is what Bharat Muni was really interested in, is to see how an emotion inspired in an audience by the performer. And the measure of the performance is really seen as how this emotion is experienced by those in the audience. And if it is a good performer, obviously we can see that this evocation of this emotion comes exactly and how it is meant to be by the performance of the performer. In short, rasa is the ultimate criterion for literalness. In other words, a dramatic performance, whatever is going on, this is the final criteria as to how am I feeling in relationship to what is being expressed by the person who is expressing. Whether it is a piece of music or a piece of art, whether it's drama which is going on the stage, it is identical with the taste of one's own blissful self, taking it to another dimension of thinking. So we can see this rasa in the context of art and drama, that it becomes a way in which that expression of the emotion can be captured by the person who is in the audience or who is observing the work of art, that it evokes certain emotions which the artist or the performer wants the audience to observe and to feel themselves. So it becomes a core idea since that time when this was introduced as a conceptual framework for thinking about emotions. It is through the many domains of arts and dance and visual arts. So going further, Rasa illuminates human emotions within the context of some creative work. Just like I mentioned, it could be poetry, it could be drama, it could be dance, it could be a piece of art which is being displayed, and it is an aesthetic concept. In other words, it's to do with this refined emotion in relationship to looking at any of these works of art. And aesthetic experience is understanding the creative work as delight. So there is, of course, an element of creativity in all these kind of artistic performances and works of art. And part of that creativity is about giving delight or a range of emotions to the observer and the person who is participating in this particular relationship between the work of art and themselves. So the objects, the persons, the situation then define the feelings present in the artistic. So various things come together to evoke a certain emotion within the person. And this emotion is manifested by the object to which the emotion is directed. Okay, so the object will create a certain manifestation of that emotion, and which is then directed to the audience, and then it becomes evocation of that particular emotion within the audience. Now, Muni Bharat's kind of concern was that the analysis of the experience of the audience while looking at the work and performance of the art, because really this is the primary connection between the observer or the audience and the work of art. If you think about why do we go to see a movie? Why do we go to see to the theater to watch a drama? Why do we listen to music? It's because we want to experience a depth of experience which includes this emotional dimension to a great degree. Okay, and analysis of this experience of the audience is really what his concern was. So Bharat Muni also assigned specific emotional values to musical notes, swara, and melodic patterns, just like I mentioned before, is that if we listen to certain kinds of music, we see that certain emotions come into our mind. So I remember one time a friend of mine, he was telling me, look, all the time, what I do, I listen to the music of Mukesh. And the idea was that he used to listen to these very sad songs of Mukesh. And he used to kind of enjoy listening to this sad music. And the moment he put on the music, that kind of sadness was evoked in his heart. And this is an indication that when we listen to some kind of music, it can be exciting, it can be provocative in certain ways, it can be very sad in other ways, it can evoke many different kinds of emotion. And Bharat Muni was actually saying that we can assign some specific emotional values to each of the notes of the musical scale. And if they are now created into a complex pattern, then there is definitely some emotion which is going to arise. So musical compositions can evoke different rasas, and especially in Indian dancing, there is an elaborate language of hand gestures, glances, body movements that is suggestive of the mood of the song. So hopefully we'll see a short video clip which will demonstrate what this kind of language which you're talking about is very suggestive. It can immediately tell us what is the mood of this performer. So dance and music combined in this way result in the evocation of various rasa during the performance. Okay, so now let's look at the types of emotions. So rasa theory implies there are a number of specific emotions, each with a distinctive flavor. And we are all very familiar with this different kinds of emotion. We know when we are angry, what happens to the mind, what happens to the thoughts, what happened to the, the total experience of anger. And we know even it translates itself into the shivering and the trembling of the body and so on and so on. In fact, very interesting that, in the Bhagavad Gita, as I'll talk about later, is the state of Arjuna. He himself describes, what is happening in his body and his mind. And it is a kind of emotion which has been aroused in him while in the middle of the battlefield, looking at the kith and kin across the battlefield. So, although this theory was formulated in terms of the art, it has had influence on many systems of thought ever since then. And of course, part of it is the Indian psychology, which I'm interested in thinking about emotions and how we tend to think differently about emotions. Because, here I will show you that, we tend to kind of formulate it in a different way. We find a different process through which we can understand the kind of, emotions and how it is aroused and expressed. So Bharat Muni then lists 49 bhavas. The bhava is, I spoke about it just now, but these are the 49 bhavas, out of which 8 are primary or sthai bhavas. These are kind of constant bhavas, which then correspond with rasa and the moods. So there is a bhava and there's the rasa. And in between, certain processes are taking place so that a certain bhava, which is there in the mind, then begins to express itself as a rasa, depending on the context in which this is being evoked. So I will talk about that process as well. One bhava was added later on to make it a total of 9 altogether. So there are also another 33 transitory states. So we can imagine that, a very fine, nuanced state of understanding emotion. That 49 bhavas, 9 different kind of sthai bhavas, and 33 transitory states between one emotion and another. So bhava refers to that which gets established by experience. So something which we experience again and again and again, there is a bhava which then comes in our experience, which is then sedimented, as it were, or gets established in our experience, especially in relationship to certain objects and people and situations. And these can also be called vasanas. And if you remember that I've talked about vasanas before, these are the kind of subconscious or subliminal inclinations and tendencies which are acquired through repeated impression, not only in this life, but even in the previous lives as well. So these are the vasanas, and one can say that certain bhavas are associated with certain kind of vasanas, and they kind of come together within a certain context to become established in the mind as bhava. So bhava manifests as rasa when there is an object within one's perception, either through the senses or from the memories. So we can remember something, and at once we start feeling irritated, or we can start feeling angry, sad, or whatever it is. And if we see something through our senses also, then there is also the evocation of certain rasa which comes about. So when bhava expresses, the person then begins to behave in a certain way. This is called anubhava. And there may be a dominant bhava in a number of secondary emotions, sanchari bhava. So secondary emotions are also associated with the total experience, and that is part of this kind of thinking about the rasa theory. This also expresses in a physical posture and behavior. So in other words, not only are we internally experiencing something, but also in the sense of the physical posture and the behavior. And if you remember that the body language is also something we can look at somebody and say, oh, this person looks depressed. Even just looking at somebody's posture, we can see a certain emotion is being expressed by this kind of physical posture itself. And this is called abhinaya. So the whole performance, the whole experience can be said to be the rasa. As a spectator watches the performance. So bhava, then anubhava, sanchari bhava, abhinaya, that becomes the total experience of the spectator. Now, the formation of emotion. How do emotions actually form? So, what is the process which is going on? And here we can think about the um, manifestation of bhava into the rasa as a conjunction between the causes and the expressions. So how is that going to work? There are four necessary conditions for this to happen. Number one, causes. All the factors that evoke the emotion that's seen in a drama, for example. Okay, so there will be various different things carrying on the stage, and this is what evokes all the factors that evoke the emotion. This is called vibhava. And then anubhava is the symptoms and expressions. These make the feeling apprehensible. For example, trembling. So this is what I can experience myself as the performer is also kind of expressing it. And sanchariva, which are ancillary feelings which are associated with the main feeling. And samayoga, which is a conjunction of all these things. So there are causes and there are effects. There are causes and there are expressions. And these are expressions which are experienced in the internal world as well as the external expression through the body. So, for example, if there is a loss of a loved one, which is the vibhava, there is shedding of the tears, anubhava, ancillary feelings like anxiety, confusion that are transient in nature, and then conjunction of all these things bring about a rasa. So you can say how it is a systematic way of thinking about what is the bhava in this person, what is the vibhava, what has caused this thing now to express itself, what are the ancillary feelings which are associated with it, and what is the connection between all these things which is giving rise to this rasa. In fact, this can be a good kind of way of understanding mental well-being and mental ill health as well. Because we can kind of categorize these vibhavas and we can categorize the main bhava in the sense of how are they associated with the life experience of this person. So you can see this rasa theory can be applied to anything and many things, which then kind of begin to take us into different domains of thinking. So think about this. So vasana, we have talked about inclinations and tendencies, and we have got the associated bhavas which are there, thought, feeling, and sensations. And then there's the vibhava, all the factors that evoke the emotion. There's the anubhava, all the behavior, and sanchari bhava, which has a secondary emotion, samayoga, conjunction of all these factors coming together to give you the rasa, which is the total experience. So we can see it is kind of systematically, there is a process going on right from the subconscious mind, subliminal mind, to categories of kind of vasanas which come together as bhava. Then it is expressed as in the context of the factors which evoke the emotion. In other words, the context within which I find myself, and all the things which come as anubhava, all the behaviors and expressions, and then the secondary emotions which are associated with, they all come together as samyoga, conjunction of all these factors to give you the total experience. Wonderful way of thinking about this. So here are the 9 bhavas. Rati, Hasya, Shoka, Krodha, Utsaha, Bhaya, Jugupsa, Vismaya, and Sama. This Sama was added later on. So these are the rasas which are associated with this bhava. Shringar, love, delight. Hasa, amusement, laughter. Hasya, Karuna, sorrow. Rodra, anger. Vira, perseverance, and kind of courage. Bhayanaka, fear. Vibhatsa, disgust. Adbhuta, wonder. Shanta, calmness. So these are the 9 bhavas and their corresponding rasas. So here's this short video clip. So you can see that, each one of these. So if you look across the screen, you can associate one with the other as they go down. So Rati is associated with Shringara. Hasya is associated with Hasa. Shoka with Karuna. Krodha with Rodra. and so on and so on. So rasa is the total experience, and these are the categories which are there in the form, which have been formed through repeated experiences of these various different things. So let's see if this video is going to work. So I'm going to just try and switch it on.
The 9 basic emotions in the Natya Shastra, the Navarasas. Love, Shringara Rasa. Karunya Rasa. Anda, Adbhuta Rasa. Laughter, Hasya Rasa. Fear, Bhayanaka Rasa. Revulsion, Bhivhatsa Rasa. Anger, Raudra Rasa. And tranquility, Shanta. The 9 basic emotions in the Natya.
Okay, so you can see the absolute wonder of this expression of emotions. And you can see how the face is so expressive in expressing any particular emotion. The eyes, the formation of the various use of the various muscles of the face, the mouth itself, and the movement of all these facial expressions give such an incredible kind of understanding of what emotion is going on. Now, this is exactly what we're talking about in terms of the power and the rasa. And it is, you can immediately kind of feel what the performer is kind of passing on to us in this kind of way. Okay, so let's look at another dimension. Now we are moving on from the kind of literature and arts to now the kind of spiritual way of looking at emotion, because that takes us into a different dimension altogether. And here what we have is the Vedantic way of looking at emotions. And we know that each system of Hindu philosophy has got an understanding about various different things. And in particular, when we look at the 6 different schools of Hindu philosophy, which I talked about some time ago in one of the lectures in Leicester, I was talking about the concept of the individual, the ideas about the cosmos and the world, and the concept of the divine. These 3 ideas, which can be called as Jiva, Jagat, and Jagdishwar. Each philosophy has got a different idea about that, and each philosophy has got a different relationship with each one. So even the idea of the individual and what the individual constitutes of, and what are the different processes which are going on in the individual, and in this relationship to our talk today, understanding of emotion is also differently described. So it sees emotion in the context of the overall goal and the purpose of life. Okay, so we know that these six systems of philosophy have got some overall goal and purpose of life, which is being described. And we know that in some systems, for example, Dvaita Vedanta, emotion of devotion is the means of attainment of liberation. And emotion comes right to the forefront as a method of expression and also as a method of progression on the spiritual pathway. So in other words, the relationship between emotion and the meaning and purpose and goal of life are somehow the ways in which this emotion is going to be used or regulated to take us on the spiritual pathway. In other systems, for example, Advaita Vedanta, some emotions, specifically of attraction and aversion, are seen to be an obstacle to the realization of the self-integration. So we will see how in this overall kind of thinking in the spiritual context, we see that some emotions become an obstacle and some emotion become helpers on the way to our spiritual goal being attained. Therefore, each will deal with emotion in a certain way in practice as well. So each one of these schools of philosophy will deal with it in a certain way. Okay, so I'm going to talk from a particular school of Advaita Vedanta because this has got a kind of different approach and also something which I'm familiar with myself as a teacher of Advaita Vedanta. But only that it has got a kind of specific perspective in terms of a school of thought. So from that point of view, the individual in the material identity consists of the gross, subtle, and causal bodies. So individual has got this gross body, which is the physical body, subtle body, which consists of the inner instruments of the mind and the intellect and so on, and the causal body, which is the cause of our existence. And each of these has certain components and functions. For example, the gross body has got the organs of perception, in other words, the senses through which I can perceive the world, and organs of actions through which I can act on the world. And subtle body, which is mana, buddhi, chit, and ahankara. These are the inner instruments. Man is the mind, buddhi is the intellect, chitta is really the kind of associated memories. And ahankara is this sense of identity which is there. And the causal body is the seat of vasanas. It is also the seat of karma and ignorance as well. It is avidya. And this gives rise to our current manifestation in this world. The emotions are the function of the mind, the mana. And the reason, cognition, is the function of the buddhi or the intellect. And these are very much taken into account on the spiritual pathway. So within the spiritual context, the mind becomes absolutely the kind of key element which has to function in a certain way for us to then proceed on to the spiritual pathway. And the vasanas are the subliminal inclination tendencies that have been accumulated over many births. Now you can begin to see the connection between the rasa theory, where they meet together in this vasanas. And although this particular school of philosophy does not talk about bhava in this very specific way and in this way, but it talks very much about vasana, the subliminal inclination tendencies, and how they express themselves in the mind and the intellect in the inner world. So what happens is that there is a trigger. So we see something or we remember something. That triggers off the vasanas, the subliminal inclination and tendencies. And that gives rise to a chain of thought and emotion, which then become expressions in the body and the mind. So you can see a similar kind of system which the rasa theory was talking about, but it is not as kind of detailed as the way in which I'm putting it here. But of course, there are many different nuances to all these different elements of this process. So, for example, I see my favorite cake in front of me. What happens? That's the trigger, and evokes the vasana for sweet foods. Suddenly, I begin to feel something in my mind, so that vasana has been triggered off, And whatever thought and feeling is associated with that vasana begins to arise in my mind and my intellect. So I think I will have a slice and I feel attraction for it and anticipate the pleasure. This is what I'm thinking and feeling. Then what happens? My mouth starts watering and I reach out and taste the cake and say, wow. So basically this is the process which happens. And it's not something which is out of our reach. I think we experience this every moment of our waking state. And you can imagine how many feelings we are going through in a day. As I was saying, 60,000 thoughts, 60,000 maybe emotions as well, if we connect the two together. But certainly there is a huge variety of emotions which we go through, different in degrees, different in intensity, but certainly there. Okay. So this is a kind of very general way of looking at the Vedanta view of emotions. And at the heart of it is about managing desire. Desire is connected with attachment, clinging and yearning, which means likes and dislikes are there, raga and dvesha are there, and they are directed towards the object of pleasure that is perceived or remembered. Just like, I see the object of pleasure in front of me, and the whole series chain of events takes place, whereby then I reach out for the cake and start eating it. And this may be an object that has already been attained or something that is anticipated to give me happiness or pleasure. So it doesn't have to be there right in front of me, but it is something which I'm thinking about or memory has brought it for me. And I anticipate the happiness and the pleasure which is going to rise out of that. So again, emotion is at the heart of this process which is taking place. If it has been attained and enjoyed, there is clinging and yearning for more of that object. So once I have got used to my favorite cup of coffee, and there is a wide variety of those different types of coffee, then every time I kind of cling on to that idea of that particular kind of coffee, and I yearn for it, especially during the times when I'm used to having that cup of coffee. So attachment then leads to clinging and yearning. Now, what is attachment? Attachment is something which I relate to the object and I get attached to it. Just like I get attached to my immediate family, my children, my parents, etc., etc. And I get attached to certain objects in my life, certain material objects. And even I get attached to ideas. And that attachment indicates an expression of the subliminal layers as well as something which is coming to me, which is then allowing me to express myself in a certain way. And when I've attained something, there is satisfaction, santosh. Again, another emotion which is being expressed. And this emotion is like a state of calmness which comes about when I have attained something. When a desire is expressed itself, when it is obtained, there is satisfaction. If the object is not attained, there is anger, krodha. If it is obtained, there is greed, lobha, and pride, mada. And if someone else has it and I don't have it, there is jealousy. All these are said to be obstacles to realize the true self, Atman, Brahman, because that is my spiritual destination. That is my spiritual goal. And if I keep on having these emotions in my life, in my existence, then they become obstacle to realization of the true self. In other words, these are rajasic, what are known as the rajasic emotions. And in this case, I'm talking about the three gunas, the sattvic, the rajasic, and the tamasic. So in the spiritual way of thinking within the spiritual context, we are talking about the rajasic and the tamasic gunas, which then become obstacles to the realization of the self. Whereas the sattvic gunas become the pathway towards my realization of the self. So now this is what is happening. There is a loop of life. There is a past conditioning, vasanas, which gives rise to thoughts and emotions in my mind and intellect. There are actions which are taking place, which create more impressions, and then it feeds back into the past conditioning. This is the sum total of experiences, inclination, tendencies, vasana. So as long as I'm caught up in this loop of life, there is no kind of way out of this for me to progress on my spiritual path. So you can see emotion then becomes the central aspect of of something which we have to deal with in our emotional life and also in relationship to my spiritual group. So these are the repeated patterns of thinking and behaving which arise. And this we can say are, the patterns which we talked about earlier on in the rasa theory as maybe bhava. Okay, so it is ignorance of avidya that keeps one bound in the world, and as long as the mind is full of thoughts and feelings, vritti, and emotions, it cannot go beyond itself to the pure consciousness Brahman. So the Advaita Vedanta approach is to still the mind, just like in the Yoga Sutra. Yoga is chitta vritti nirodha, which means bringing about the stillness of the mind. So also here we are talking about the stillness of the mind, making it a sattvic mind by methods of karma yoga and bhakti yoga. And if you remember bhakti, the rasa of bhakti is this fantastic, emotion of devotion, which is mentioned so much in our Bhagavatam and the Bhagavad Gita as a central emotion, which is going to, make our journey to the ultimate possible. This also reduces the rajasic thoughts and the emotions that we kind of practice karma yoga and bhakti yoga. When the mind is thus prepared, it is ready to go into a deep state of meditation or a kind of contemplation on the divine and transcend itself into the ultimate reality. Therefore, the whole idea is to refine the thoughts and the emotions to become more and more and more sattvic, and then to let go completely of the me and the mind through contemplation and meditation. So, in other words, at the heart of our spiritual sadhana or spiritual practice is the regulation of the emotion, the discipline of controlling the emotion, not only the emotion, but also thoughts and our actions. And if we have this discipline, which is established through the practice of karma yoga and bhakti yoga, it prepares the ground for us to then proceed to the spiritual goal. Okay, so let me finally then talk about Bhagavad Gita and the emotion, because then we see a particular way in which we have to kind of understand emotion in the context of the Bhagavad Gita. So you know that Bhagavad Gita is a discourse between Lord Shri Krishna and Arjuna, who is one of the greatest warriors of his time. And in the middle of the battlefield, he finds himself in an emotional crisis. Again, emotion at the heart of the teaching. And this is the battle between the two cousins, the sets of cousins, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And he sees the kith and kin in front of him and goes into a state of grief and anxiety at the prospect of killing them. He himself describes his emotional state, one of anxiety and grief. And he says, my whole body is trembling, just like I was telling you earlier on. My Gandiva bow is slipping, and my skin is burning. My legs are trembling, unable to stand any longer due to impatience, forgetfulness, and the whirling of the mind. I see only causes of misfortune. Can you see that this is a kind of such a detailed description of the state of Arjuna as he is in the middle of the battlefield. This is his emotional state of grief and anxiety. So, what has that got to do with us? In the sense that the Bhagavad Gita deals with the human condition, and Arjuna can be seen as the representative of humanity and who is being guided by the divine teacher, Bhagavan Krishna. Here's the problem of Arjuna, is the problem of the jiva, you and me. Arjuna is experiencing in the middle of the battlefield a crisis which is resulting in shoka, grief about things that have come to pass, moha, delusion about the present moment, and bhaya, anxiety about the future. So he then goes into a crisis of choice, and he tells Lord Krishna, look, I am totally confused. I don't know what to do. Tell me exactly what to do. So you can see the relationship between emotion and a high emotional state and the dysfunctionality which comes about as a result of that. So this is what happens when we go from mental well-being to mental illness. There is this dysfunctionality comes about because there is this huge emotion which then takes over and makes us to be dysfunction in terms of our self-efficacy and self-regulation. These are the two things which are associated with this high kind of tension which comes about as a matter of this emotion within ourselves. Now, this is the human existence and condition, the identity and the experience of suffering. So what we are trying to solve in this case is the problem of suffering. That how do we get out of the suffering on one hand and become totally functional to perform our bounden duty. This is what the problem is. And it is because of the mistaken belief about oneself, misidentification and wrongful attachment to things, beings and happening, and self-centered desire that this is what is happening. So Bhagavad Gita gives us a solution to this human condition of extreme suffering and grief. And it takes that into account and says that these are at the center of our human experience, whether to one degree or another, we are always having this suffering going on, grief going on, various different emotions are arising, and we try to deal with these, but they remain and keep on coming back again and again. And the Gita gives us a method by which the human condition is reframed into another vision of meaning, purpose, and values. And it points out the transcendental divine reality one needs to become aware of. And this becomes the context of the meaning and the purpose to live a life of dharma. So if we now switch over to another way of thinking and behaving in the world, then it will take us towards the ultimate destination, which is liberation or moksha. Now, it is said in 8:15 Bhagavad Gita that this particular life is dukkhalayam, and it is ashashvata. Dukkhalayam means it's an abode of suffering, and it is temporary. So this is how Vedanta sees the human condition. And it says that every living being must undergo the process of rebirth, but if one can reach Brahman, then the process of rebirth is stopped. So this suffering can come to a standstill, or it can stop simply because we have now transcended the human identity. And one needs to achieve liberation from this existence by systematically following the prescription of the Bhagavad Gita. So, in other words, dealing with emotion, regulating ourselves in the mind and the intellect, regulating our emotions and thoughts, and functioning in the right way in the transactional world through dharma, doing our bounden duty, one can achieve liberation. So again, we can see that emotion is at the heart of this discipline. So it gives us the solution to the human condition, and this is what happens. The Advaita Vedanta again, this is the interpretation of a two-stage journey. First stage is where purification takes place, where self-centered ego desires are controlled, all actions, thoughts are dedicated to the divine with emotion of devotion. Attachment to objects, being and situations are withdrawn because attachment has got a charge of emotion associated with it. They are withdrawn through contemplation and detachment and the focus on the divine. And then the second stage is absorption, whereby through deep contemplation and meditation on the divine, one attains one's true nature, realization of the self or as Brahman. So two stages. Again, emotion and control of emotion is at the heart of this, and it requires for us to understand our emotion, understand where the attachment is, understand where the desire is in relationship to those attachments, and to function and to control through self-discipline the emotion and the thoughts to bring us further on the pathway to realization of a spiritual destination. So this we can look at it in a kind of diagrammatic way. There is the ego operating system, which then we go towards the Dharma operating system, to the God operating system, where the ego operating system is self-centered, full of emotion, selfishness, rajasic and tamasic tendencies, and then it is all about me and mine. And what Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga do is to transfer us to the Dharma operating system, which is God-centered. Selflessness is there, detachment is there, there is the emotion of devotion which is there, and it is about thee and thine, the divine. And when one has realized through Dhyana Yoga, Jnana Yoga, etc., it becomes humanity-centered. There is no self or ego. There is only the pure love and compassion, which is expressed. Again, at the heart of our spiritual endeavor is this pure love and compassion and the divine design. It is no longer about me and mine, but it is about the divine design, purification, and then self-realization. So this is how one can kind of look at the prescription of the Bhagavad Gita. Okay, so selfless service, devotion, knowledge, and yoga. Action is inevitable, like Lord Krishna says, and if one acts in the world as a doer and enjoyer, there will be suffering. Selfless service means a kind of transaction in the world for purification and liberation. And devotion to God is by dedicating actions to God, who is seen as this creation. So we look at the world around us and we begin to see divinity in all the things around us. And there are specific chapters in the Bhagavad Gita which deal with looking at this manifest divine as Saguna Brahman. In other words, God with attributes in this material nature. And we can begin to have this emotion of devotion as we perceive the world around us as nothing but a body of, and then the knowledge about the divine and the soul that takes one to this state of liberation. So yoga leads to a state of samadhi. So here we've got karma yoga, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, and ashtanga yoga. All this kind of come together in the Bhagavad Gita to give us a very kind of detailed way in which we can proceed on our spiritual journey. And of course, we have got the three masters. We have got Madhvacharya ji, who speaks about it from the Dvaita point of view. We have got Ramanujacharya, who speaks from it from the Vishishta Advaita point of view. And Adi Shankaracharya ji, who talks about the Bhagavad Gita interpretation, is from the Advaita Vedanta. So there will be these three variations which are there, but at the heart of it is this kind of thinking. So Bhakti Yoga, if you think just briefly about it, the path of devotion expressing the divine emotion of devotion. So in chapter number 12, Arjuna asks Bhagavan Krishna, who is the better yogi? Is it the one who worships the unmanifest or the one who worships the manifest with name and form? So Krishna says that one who worships the manifest is the best yogi, although the other attains liberation as well. But the path of the unmanifest, which means to kind of sit down in meditation in this deep state of absorption, is very hard. But to see the divine with a name and a form, I can have the image of Krishna right in front of me and I can immediately relate to that and have a feeling of emotion as soon as I see the Murti in front of me. But the unmanifest is very hard. So how is that to be done? Ever content, steady in meditation, self-control, possessed of firm conviction, with the mind and intellect dedicated to me, he, my devotee, is dear to me. So who is the devotee? Somebody with these qualities. And here we can see mind and intellect dedicated to me, which means the thoughts are turning towards God and the emotion of devotion is turning towards God. That becomes the perfect devotee. And Krishna gives 36 characteristics of this devotee. And some of these are kind of has an emotional content as well, these characteristics. For example, contentment, no hate, calmness in the mind. So you can see, that not only are we talking about the emotion of devotion, but some of the characteristics as we follow the path of devotion begin to arise in ourselves as these positive, sattvic emotions which begin to develop in ourselves. So chapter 18 gives a summary of this path of devotion. It says, existing as Brahman with his mind made tranquil. So you can see tranquility is again a kind of emotion, neither laments nor hankers for anything. He is equal to all beings, equanimity of the mind. Such a person achieves the highest state of devotion to me. And it is through this devotion that he gains knowledge. Devotion is put at the heart of it, and out of devotion arises the gaining of the knowledge of my greatest, of my true identity. When thus he sees properly, understands me, he then immediately enters into my being, always performing his prescribed duties, karma yoga, whilst remaining dependent on me, surrender to God. Through my grace, he attains the eternal changeless state. So again, emotion at the heart of it, the emotion of devotion primarily directed towards the divine as a means of getting us to the divine destination. So the logic is in this manner, is that, we are kind of living a self-centered life, the individual under the influence of the material nature and three attributes, the three gunas. And this leads to a constant experience of the emotion of Shoka, Moha, and Bhaya, just as I mentioned, and the basis of three sources of suffering, forces of nature, Adideva, Adidevic, external condition, Adibhutik, and internal condition, Adhyatmik. So these are the sources of suffering, and they give me Shoka, Moha, and Bhaya. So this is constantly going on, and it kind of binds us to this life, to this identity, and so on. So the ultimate solution to the problem of suffering is liberation from the cycle of birth and death by means of what? By means of prescription of the scriptures, letting go of rajasic emotions that are an obstacle, raga, dvesha, likes and dislikes, and all the other ones which I mentioned before, living a life of dharma, doing the bounden duty, cultivating sattvic emotion of devotion together with all the ancillary emotions like calmness and positivity, and that takes us to the ultimate realization of this self. Okay, so I started off by telling you about understanding the emotion, a bit of detail about the rasa theory of emotion, types of emotion, the formation of emotion, the process by which we experience emotion. And then I talked a bit about the spiritual dimension of emotion in the Vedantic point of view. And then finally, we saw how Bhagavad Gita talks about emotion, taking us to the spiritual dimension. And on the right-hand side, you can see the Navarasa, the 9 different types of emotion which are expressed in this kind of way. And that is what we saw in the short with you. So thank you very much. And that brings me to the end of this talk. I will stop sharing so that we can then see where we are. There you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ramesh Bhai, for this very thoughtful and very insightful talk on emotions. What I'd like to do is just explain to people how they can ask questions. So please bear with me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to request everybody to turn their videos off. And at the moment, you are all muted as well. Should you have a question, what we can do is you can either express yourself through the chat box or identify yourself in the chat box, and we will then unmute you, or we will give you permission to unmute yourself. So please do it one at a time. And I'm going to now make that option available where you will be able to unmute yourselves, but let's have some order here. And so can I start by asking you a question, Ramesh Bhai, if I may, please?
Sure.
What I'd like to do is, one thing that comes to mind is this immense sense of dissatisfaction all the time. So what I'd like to say is, why is Anubhava, why is Santosha as an Anubhava so scarce in our lives? Would you take us through that, explore that a little bit with us, please?
Yeah, so why there is this dissatisfaction is that if we think about the human identity from this Hindu perspective, is that everybody is looking for two things only in the world. One is that everybody is looking for happiness in the world, and everybody is trying to get away from sorrow and suffering. Now, we have this idea that I'm going to find my happiness through the things and the beings and the situations of the world. Again, this is a kind of Vedantic explanation. And I keep on kind of going back again and again and again to the world and trying to get my happiness from there. And again, I get dissatisfied. Why? Because either I don't get the result which I wanted, or even if I get the result, it is only a partial result. And therefore, dissatisfaction is kind of part and parcel of my functioning in life. You see what I mean? So that even in one day, I can go through so many different types of dissatisfaction. Why? Because we are functioning from a place of desire. And desire is what propels us to be experiencing life and transacting in life in such a way that desire is at the forefront of my life. And desire is about what? It is about looking for happiness in my own little world. And I'm saying to myself, if I go here, I'll find happiness. If I go there, I'll find happiness. But the situation is this, that this kind of happiness is not available because the kind of connection between what my expectation is and what the reality of the result is, there is always going to be the gap. And therefore, always there is going to be dissatisfaction. So one of the 5 lessons of life which I talk about is that dissatisfaction guaranteed. In life, dissatisfaction will be guaranteed one way or the other, because whether it is in our life as material things or our relationship with people or situations and circumstances which we are caught up in, we will find dissatisfaction one way or the other.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So just a very, very simple and probably on a, well, I'll ask the question, then you can tell me. So if I have an Amazon account, will that lead to sthirta and thus a sattvic mind?
Depending on what you're doing with the Amazon account.
Okay.
Well, if you look at it from, the kind of dharmic point of view,
Yes.
then of course anything which is going to take you towards the spiritual pathway. So on the one hand, is it helping me towards the punya karma? In other words, doing meritorious actions in my life. Is it giving me enough understanding about what life is all about and what do I need to do in order to move towards a spiritual destination?
Yes.
So you remember there are 4 purusharths in the way of thinking. Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. These are the 4 efforts. These are the 4 goals in life. And if I take Dharma and Moksha out of that picture, then what am I left with? Artha and Kama, which becomes about desire and material desire and my passions always expressing themselves.
Sure.
And therefore I get caught up in my ego identity and I get caught up in this individuality of my own self and the experience of this dissatisfaction which you talked about earlier.
Okay.
Now, if I put Dharma and Moksha as the context in which I'm going to function, then of course everything changes. My relationship to the world changes, my relationship to the people around me changes, everything changes, my transactions change, my choices change, everything changes. So if my Amazon account is going to take me in that direction, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think we have a question from Nitin Bhai. Nitin Bhai, if you would kindly unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Hi, Ramesh Bhai, can you hear me?
Yes, Nitin.
It's a fantastic talk, and I think you just about answered the question in a different way. Perhaps you might. I saw one of the other questions was how do you bring this philosophy philosophy into modern curricula or Western curricula in psychotherapy. My question is around, the external influences which we have and the natural desire to achieve or be successful and all that. But at the same time, the dilemma of actually saying, how can I not make sure that, how can I be grounded, or how can I still retain all my relationships and still be completely ordinary and normal and almost selfless. And I think you probably suggested that you need to work in the context of all the four artha, karma, dharma, and moksha together. Could you elucidate on that, please, again?
Okay, so
Okay.
um, I think sometimes we separate these two things out, and we say either I can live a transactional life or I can live a spiritual life. But I think at the heart of it, there is this kind of synthesis which is given in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, that you can still be effective and efficient in whichever sphere of your life you engage with, even if you function within the context of dharma and moksha. So, for example, some people think, oh, if I go on the spiritual path, I'll have to give up this, I'll have to give up that, I'll have to become detached from my children. How can I become detached from my children? Because I'm not going to be feeling anything for them, etc., etc. I think sometimes that there is a kind of mistaken belief about that, and I think what needs to be understood is that functioning in a dharmic way, functioning with this kind of discipline of the mind, and for example, dedicating all my actions to God, it takes my kind of personalized, individualized sense of functioning in the world to a different level of functioning altogether. So that not only does it make me more efficient, but it also makes me more effective. And of course, I can talk about this in terms of the two things which I mentioned before: self-efficacy and self-regulation, which is again at the heart of psychotherapy and psychological thinking. Now, self-efficacy means what? That I am effective in what I do and I do it efficiently. Okay. Now, how is that going to come unless I have got this discipline of the mind? So, living a dharmic life, that kind of discipline comes automatically because that requires a tremendous amount of control in the mind and the emotion. So self-efficacy is really something which is part and parcel of my dharmic living. And also self-regulation. Now, this is in the context of what I was talking earlier on about emotions. So that I am able to regulate my emotion in such a way that I become much more kind of emotionally intelligent. In fact, I always say that if you are living a dharmic life, you are likely to raise your EQ, your emotional quotient. Why? Because you become so refined in your reception of emotion, regulation of emotion, and expression of emotion. So there is no kind of, I don't see a split between the two things. On the one hand, we talk about ambition. How can I give up my ambition? No. If you are in the workplace and if you're working for the Lord, you will do the best you can. In fact, it allows you to go beyond this kind of way of being tense about what you want to achieve and become without any tension so that you can function even better with this kind of self-efficacy. So there is a kind of connection between these two things. And if you kind of look at it from that perspective and within that context, it will allow us to kind of bring those two elements in a good way in our lives.
I may ask you a question on behalf of Sonia, Ramesh Bhai.
Yep.
The question is, how do we tell the difference between mind, heart, and gut feelings?
Okay. So mind, heart, in the kind of scriptural way of thinking, sometimes these are used in different ways in different contexts. So, for example, when Bhagwan Ramana Maharshi talks about the heart, he talks about the essence of ourselves. So he says, put your mind in your heart. Now, that cannot literally be done, of course. But what he means is that my kind of attentive mind, which is now concentrated, is to be placed in my true essence. In other words, if I have an idea about the nature of the self or the nature of the divine, I put my total attention and get absorbed in the heart. And this heart is nothing but the divine. So you can see that, heart and mind sometimes are in the ordinary language spoken of as one thing, because the heart is the seat of the feelings, and in the mind there are also feelings going on, but it is distinguished from the intellect. Intellect is the seat of rationality, whereas the mind in the Vedantic way of thinking is really something which is mentioned in relationship to the feelings. So feelings, emotions with the mind, rationality, reason, and thinking with the intellect. So these are kind of taken as two different functionalities of the inner instrument. Now, when we talk about gut feeling is more like that I get this sense that something is going to happen. My gut feeling is that this is the truth. My gut feeling is that this is going to happen. Now, that can be a result of all my experiences which I've had before, so that I don't have to go through this thinking rational process. I don't have to feel anything. At once, this gut feeling comes in my mind, and this gut feeling is about I feel something is going to happen, or I feel that this is what it is all about. So this is how I see the relationship between those three things. But of course, within the context of also understanding that there is the rational part, the intellect. There is also the thinking in the Vedantic way about the heart and the mind, and the heart is sometimes seen as the essence of myself.
Okay.
So again, depends on what definition you give to these things, then you can kind of try to work out the relationship between these things.
Okay, thank you, Ramesh Bhai. So we have, I hope it's okay if I continue asking you questions on behalf of the participants, Ramesh Bhai. Have you got time?
You must have a big list of questions.
I'm going to field a few more questions, if I may, Ramesh Bhai. We'll try and keep them brief. Okay. So there's a question here from Anjana Nathwani, and her question is, how can we influence the psychotherapy curriculum to consider the Vedantic philosophy? Have we made any inroads in that respect?
Yes, definitely, because there is a huge tradition of Indian psychology. And part of my research at Oxford was about the Yoga Sutra and the yoga psychology, as it were. And from that, one one can develop, or I have developed a method by which you can use some of the yogic techniques in psychotherapy. So, for example, some of the meditative techniques which we use in the yogic way. Anjana, I think you are a yoga teacher, so that you may understand this. So, for example, if I talk about pratyahar, which means how can I withdraw my attention from the outer world and place it within my mind? Now, that is a very simple technique which begins to then give us a disconnection between the outer world and my inner world, and how can I disconnect from the outer world for a few moments, which gives me a different sense of energy. And this different sense of my being with myself can have a good effect, because now I can perceive my inner world rather than it being distracted within the outer world. You see what I mean? So that these are techniques which can be used within counseling and psychotherapy. For example, meditative mindfulness, again, a yogic technique. And this can be used in our day-to-day life, whereby we want to regulate our emotions and our thoughts by getting into this meditative mode of the mind. And if we are able to do that, again, self-regulation becomes easier, and also the efficacy of ourselves will begin to be attained by us. So briefly, I think just pointing a few things out there.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Ramesh Bhai. Can I ask Trushar Patel to unmute himself and ask the question? Please keep it brief, as time is at a premium. Thank you. Okay, we seem to have lost Trushar here, so we will go on to the next question. There is a question from Kiran. It says, how do we tell the difference between duty and internal desire, especially in motherhood?
Hari Om.
So,
Please go ahead, Ramesh Bhai.
okay. So the question was about internal desire and
And it was between duty and internal desire,
yes,
especially in relation to motherhood.
okay, that's right. So I guess what you're talking about is, motherhood involves a certain relationship with the child. And mother and child relationship, there is a kind of internal desire which is associated with motherhood. And then dharma means a kind of a way of having that relationship transformed in a different way. So what we are talking about here is that there is a kind of desire and then a kind of emotion which is associated with the internal desire and how we function with the child, how the mother will function with the child. And if we then think about how is it related to dharma. So now the kind of distinction between dharma and personal selfish desire, or in a sense egoistic desire or ego desire. So on the one hand, we can think about ego desire, which is related to my inclination and tendencies. It has to do with my individual identity, and therefore it expresses itself in my relationship with other people. On the other hand, the dharma aspect is that what is my duty as a mother? How can I perform it to the best of my ability within the context of putting this in the divine context, knowing that this relationship is divine relationship, and knowing that there are certain things which I have to exclude from that particular way of thinking and relationship, and there are some emotions which I have to express in relationship to the child without attachment. Now, this is sometimes difficult to understand. How can I have emotion without attachment? So the emotion which is primarily then associated with dharma is the one of love and compassion, which is unconditional. So you can see that internal desire may limit me in certain ways in relationship with the child. There may be limitation in terms of how I relate to the child in a codependent way, or I can think of functioning within the context of dharma so that it becomes a way in which I can relate myself to my child through the lens of dharma, which allows me more freedom. It allows me a kind of way in which I can express my emotion in this unconditional, compassionate way. And therefore, it becomes a different kind of relationship which has got a spiritual basis. So there is some kind of movement away from the internal desire to internal emotion to the internal relationship which is derived from there, towards thinking about a dharmic kind of relationship where the bound and duty is at the heart of it, but the emotional connection is still retained with a positive love and compassion which goes beyond any kind of condition.
Okay.
I hope that gives you a certain perspective.
Okay, thank you very much, Ramesh Bhai. So I think we have Trushar Patel now. He's going to unmute himself. Can I ask Trushar, please keep your question brief. Thank you.
Thank you, Hari Om, Ramesh Uncle. Thank you for the talk. The the bhava and the different rasas applicable to our kind of looking at the BMI chart, looking at the kind of mind, because they're kind of coming under the feeling category. If we were to take a zoomed out perspective, then on the Buddhimaya kosha, do these bhavas exist? Can we intellectualize them, or is that not possible? Or would that be a more meaningful approach to conquer / utilize the bhavas to allow our karmas to be aligned to a goalful dharmic life? Thank you.
Yes. Yes, thank you. So it means that bhavas are categories of both thought and feeling. Okay, so there are certain feelings, emotions which are associated with certain types of thought and patterns of thought. So for example, anger. If you look at anger, then there is a specific emotion which is being experienced. At the same time, there are certain thoughts which are associated with it. So that becomes a kind of bhava. And then it expresses itself as something which I feel and experience in myself in the inner world as well as in my body. So the body, mind, intellect become the instruments through which the bhava is expressing itself, and the total experience. Remember, it is also including thought and feeling and sensation in the body. So at the level of the intellect are the thoughts, at the level of the mind is the emotion, at the level of the body are the sensations. All these things come together as rasa. So like I mentioned that, this is kind of interesting that we can then move from the dramatic arts, which is a total expression of all the emotion, towards the spiritual way of thinking, where there are certain emotions which we need to get away from, and there are certain emotions which we move towards. So certain categories of our thinking and feeling will then be phased out, as it were, on the spiritual pathway, and there are certain which we need to cultivate and develop, if they are not there, to move us on the spiritual pathway to a destination. So I think this is basically the kind of connection between the rasa theory and the spiritual pathway.
Okay, thank you very much, Ramesh Bhai. I'm sorry to all the participants. I don't think we are going to be able to take any more questions as we are really out of time. We scheduled an hour and a half. So I'd like to ask Raj Bhai Chavan to say a few words and express a vote of thanks. Thank you very much, Ramesh Bhai, for a very insightful talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Deepak.
Thank you.
As always, Ramesh Bhai, it's a pleasure listening to you again after such a long time. Yeah, and I think we're going to schedule you again very soon as you can.
Okay.
It was delightful to hear your voice again. And the insight into how it opens up our mind is amazing. Yeah, thank you once again.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rajbhai, Ramila, and thank you for inviting me.
No, you know that we do these talks as a benefit, or at least to fundraise towards the work of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies.
That's right.
And you give your services free of charge towards that as well. So thank you, really. But my just request to all the participants who are listening today, that towards the end of your talk, generally we look to raise some money towards the cause for the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. I would request they go on to the website and donate what they can, because whilst the COVID is alive, the center still needs to remain alive and functional, right? So please donate what they can, wherever they can, online through the main Oxford Center website. Thank you. With that in mind, look forward to seeing you all again next time.
Thank you so much.
One final thing, to all the people who took the time out today, thank you so much. The presence was increased tremendously. What I'd request is this, we are trying to get the global friends group together here. So, wherever the timing in the mid-afternoon is designed to accommodate people in India or the US or whatever, hence the mid-afternoon 4 o'clock time. So please do put it out there that we are looking to reach and even get speakers from around the globe and reach out to people around the globe. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Have a pleasant evening and goodbye from all of us. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.